colleague from Virginia is on the floor. Would my colleague from Virginia consider asking a question?
Mr. President, will the senator from Oregon yield for a question?
I will yield for a question, yes.
And Mr. President, I'm actually going to ask two questions. I'm going to tell a story about something that's happened recently in Virginia and ask my colleague from Oregon what he thinks about it. And then I'm going to hand my colleague from Oregon a picture and ask my colleague what he thinks about that. To begin with the story, and the story deals with a topic that may not seem that sexy or something, but that I think is pretty important: U.S. attorneys and the rule of law. Virginia has two United States attorneys, Western District of Virginia and the Eastern District of Virginia. And those two U.S. attorneys who were put in office by President Trump have both recently been forced out of office because they wouldn't engage in political persecution of Donald Trump's enemies. Let me describe the situation to my colleague from Oregon. When the Trump administration began, the two U.S. attorneys who had been recommended by President Biden and voted on, confirmed by the Senate, both stepped down, as is the norm. The Trump administration then elevated in the Eastern District of Virginia an individual by the name of Eric Siebert. First, the Department of Justice appointed him for 120 days, and then that was followed by an appointment by the judges of the court. But his initial appointment into the role was by the Trump administration. Mr. Siebert began his career as a D.C. police officer and then served for 15 years as a prosecutor in one of the most important positions in the U.S. attorney's offices nationally. Senator Warner and I interviewed candidates, and we recommended Eric Siebert to the Trump administration. So they had put him in as the interim, and then he had been confirmed as the acting. We recommended him to the Trump administration. The Trump administration nominated him, and the Judiciary Committee, in an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote, reported him to the floor of the Senate. But before the Senate could act on that bipartisan vote by the Judiciary Committee, Eric Siebert was forced out of office. And he was forced out of office because he refused to prosecute, to indict former FBI Director Jim Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James. He said there was no evidence to support an indictment in the case, and so this individual who had been put in office by the Trump administration was forced out. In the Western District of Virginia, which covers more of Virginia's landmass but a smaller portion of the Virginia population, Senator Merkley, we had a process like you do in Oregon, and Senator Warner and I recommended two candidates to the White House, and one was a gentleman named Todd Gilbert. Todd Gilbert was a Republican member of our House of Delegates from Shenandoah County, Virginia, who was the leader of the Republican caucus in our House of Delegates, a strong supporter of President Trump's, and he had even been Speaker of the House when the Republicans held the majority in the Virginia General Assembly. A very solid individual, very much with Republican bona fides in supporting President Trump. But he applied to be the U.S. attorney. He had been a local prosecutor, but also a local defense attorney. President Trump installed him as the interim and nominated him for the position. Before the Senate Judiciary Committee could take him up, the Trump Department of Justice pressured Todd Gilbert to fire the chief deputy who had been the deputy in that office leading criminal prosecutions during multiple presidential terms. Todd Gilbert refused to do it, and Todd Gilbert was forced to resign as a result. Subsequent reporting by the New York Times laid out the facts that we believe to be true, that the Trump administration wanted to push out the assistant because the assistant was unwilling to issue indictments that were political in nature against Trump's political enemies, and for that reason, they pressured Todd Gilbert to fire his assistant. Todd Gilbert, who had given up his position in the Virginia General Assembly to take this position within a month walked out of the U.S. Attorney's Office rather than succumb to a politically motivated firing of a longtime dedicated prosecutor. In 2 instances, the chief federal law enforcement officials in Virginia, installed in their positions by the Trump administration, were forced to leave because they wouldn't agree to bend the knee and genuflect to a politically motivated persecution campaign. And so my question to my colleague is, you're talking about creeping authoritarianism. What does it say when the executive makes moves on law enforcement officials, Republican law enforcement officials, because they won't bend the knee and politically persecute people against whom there is no actionable claim?
I thank so much my colleague from Virginia for laying out this story, which has been quite presented because of its extraordinary nature. To have U.S. attorneys basically fired on short order because they stood up for the principle of the rule of law, rather than agreeing to be part of a political persecution or prosecution team. And I must say they're candidates to go up on my wall of heroes. And I so respect. Now here, as you said with Todd, he wasn't coming from the blue side of the aisle. And he wasn't just a newbie to the House. He was the leader of the House Republicans, which meant when they were in charge, he was the Speaker. Now, I was a Speaker as well. I always have a little affection for the speakers, but I know how difficult it can be to run a chamber. And so you have to be deeply, deeply connected to your colleagues in your caucus as you manage that process. So this individual, just by that resume, clearly was coming with a set of values deeply rooted in the Republican Party. But the value he didn't have was to screw over innocent people. And thank goodness we still have people willing to stand up for justice. Not, if you will, injustice. Because that's what we're seeing. And we see it in the form of the enemies list that the president is going after. But we also see it, and more hidden normally, the firing of individuals, the tossing of individuals who aren't willing to take a loyalty test. Their loyalty is to the Constitution, not to the president. So I think it says a tremendous amount about how far we are into the authoritarian state. This is kind of standard operating procedure for an authoritarian. You mentioned kind of creeping authoritarianism. I would say we're on full stream authoritarianism because so much is happening in terms of the firing of employees who are failing the loyalty test, the decimating of programs at the whim of the president rather than by laws being passed here, the ignoring of laws that apply to the executive, like the fact that you can't fire inspector generals unless they for cause in 30 days, the attack on due process and free speech and free press, the weaponization in general of the Justice Department, of which this is kind of a facet of it, and then the effort to get court decisions that enable the president to deploy the military in the streets when there is no insurrection, no rebellion, and no invasion. And this last piece, I think, is extraordinarily dangerous. Not yet an issue that has come to your home in Virginia, but it's come to Southern California and to D.C. and to Portland, Oregon, and to Chicago, Illinois, and there will be others, because the whole intent is to have the court decisions resolved that provide the precedent for deploying troops when and how the president wants, according to his definition of what a rebellion is or an insurrection is, as opposed to the reality. So there are no checks then on that use of military. So these are all so many things happening all at once. Remember, we are simply 9 months into this administration. Wow. I mean, it's breathtaking. The team had to have a careful plan, ready to roll with things that were going to be done every day. And that is why they had Project 2025. That is why they have Russ Vogt at the head of OMB, being the engineer of that Trumpian train. And we're in big trouble, so we're ringing the alarm bells. You're ringing the alarm bells. The people, and they're 7 million strong on the weekend, were ringing the alarm bells. And the biggest demonstration in U.S. history on a single day. But that is so important right now if we're going to save our republic. And thank you for being a core part of the rescue team.
Let me tell
I yield for a possible additional question.
Mr. President, might the senator from Oregon yield for another question?
Yes, I will. For a question.
Thank you. And I'll tell a quick story, and then I'm going to hand you this picture now, because my question is going to be for you to describe it. But I'll tell a quick story on the authoritarianism front. And this is a very Virginia story. And then I'm going to ask my colleague to describe the picture that I've just handed him. So Virginia is an unusual state. 50 states have mottos. All states have mottos. Almost all states have mottos that are positive. Excelsior, onward, to the stars through adversity. My favorite, because it's so random, positive motto is Michigan. It says, it's Latin, but the translation is, if you seek a pleasant peninsula, look about you. How random. I wasn't looking for a peninsula, but I would rather it be pleasant than unpleasant. Virginia's is the only motto that's not positive. The Virginia motto was designed by the framers of the Virginia Constitution, who were meeting in Williamsburg when the framers of the American Constitution were meeting in, the Declaration of Independence was being drafted and voted on in Philadelphia. The Declaration voted on in Philadelphia July 4, 1776. July 5, 1776, in Williamsburg, the Virginia B team that weren't in Philadelphia, they did 4 really cool things. They passed the first Virginia Constitution. They enacted the first Virginia Bill of Rights, which became a model for the National Bill of Rights. They elected Patrick Henry, the first governor of Virginia. But the 4th thing they did was they had a 4-member committee appointed that spent 4 days in the library at William & Mary to design a state seal. And the state seal, which I'm wearing, I wear this all the time, is an unusual one. It is a woman Amazon representing virtue standing atop a deposed monarch whose crown has fallen off. And the state motto, the only one that isn't a positive, the Virginia motto, is a warning. It's a rebuke. It's Latin, sic semper tyrannis, thus be it always to tyrants. And the framers picked the future verb tense. They didn't say down with tyrants, we don't like tyrants, we've defeated tyrants. They used the future verb tense because they believed that tyranny wasn't a form of government, it was a fact of human nature. It was a fact of human nature that would not go away, and we would always need virtue to be able to defeat tyranny. And so as you're talking about authoritarianism and where we are, I'm just reminded of the fact that Virginians predicted in 1776 that the nation would need to always be on guard against tyranny. And in the formation of the Constitution, and my colleague has done a great job of looking at provisions of the Constitution, we invested a lot of power in the hands of an executive, but then we put checks, Congress, the courts, a free press. You shouldn't go to war without a vote of Congress. The appropriations power was for Congress, not the president. We put all these checks in place to stop the reality of tyranny. And as we round the corner into 250 years of American democracy, we are a nation looking in the mirror and asking ourselves the question of whether we still believe in democracy over tyranny. Do we still believe it? In 1776, 30% of Americans were for monarchy. When we tell the story of the revolution, it wasn't that 100% of Americans believed in democracy. 30% were for tyranny and monarchy. It was what they knew, or they had a financial tie, or a family tie to England, or maybe they were worried that democracy would be too messy. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that democracy would be the choice. Every generation has to answer the question for itself. Do we still prefer in democracy over tyranny? And as we face this 250th anniversary of the nation's birth, we're confronted with that. I've handed my colleague a photo. I had hoped to have it on a poster, but the photo was taken today. And I didn't have time to turn it into a poster. But I want to ask my colleague from Oregon to describe what it is you see in that photograph.
Well, thank you for the question. I thought when you were going to hand me this, I was going to have a Rorschach test or something of that nature. But I knew within seconds what this was. As soon as I realized it was machinery and not parts of a bridge. But this is the demolition at the White House to prepare for some $300 million ballroom. At least that's what I'm nominating as my answer. And I would yield you a question if you would like to follow up.
I would love to ask a follow-up question if the senator would allow.
I will indeed. Question.
You know what a metaphor is. A metaphor is something that not only stands for itself, but it stands for something else. As you look at that picture of the White House being demolished today, at the very time as you were standing on this floor talking about authoritarianism hurting the institutions that were put in place 250 years ago, what is your feeling about the true significance of this demolition project going on at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue?
You're asking such a cerebral and philosophical question here as I'm in the 20-whatever hour days. But here we have evidence of the president tearing down a symbol of our republic and building a symbol that is really a symbol about authoritarian power, about a government that serves the rich. Just the fact that we're spending money on a $300 million ballroom, which I can't even imagine how it could cost that much, when at the same time the president will not come as requested by the minority leader in the House and the minority leader in the Senate and sit down and work on, and I'm sure they're willing to go to him, and sit down and work on the fact that we are facing 20 million people who are going to have their health care costs doubled. But instead of addressing that, the president's tearing down part of the symbol of our republic, a president, and building a symbol of a king.
With that, Mr. President, I yield, and I thank my colleague from Oregon for this important conversation and for your stamina and patriotism.